And coming back to our top story of the day, with two major meetings that may change the course of the war in Ukraine. To talk about what lies ahead in the context of the Wednesday EU-Ukraine-US summit and the Trump-Putin meeting, I'm joined by Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland. Good evening, Ambassador. Good to see you back on the program.
Dobry wieczór.
Dobry wieczór. So, according to the latest information, we have further Russian offensive. We have north of the town of Pokrovsk being taken by small Russian forces. And as that is happening, we are ahead of the meeting that I just mentioned, the Wednesday summit, and the meeting supposed to take place in Alaska between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. European and Ukrainian leaders, do you think that they should feel hopeful about the impact they would have on President Trump ahead of the meeting with Vladimir Putin? Are they going to have enough influence on the shape of the negotiations? What's your opinion?
I'm glad that Vice President Vance met with European leaders to discuss Ukraine. He did so in London. I'm glad that President Trump is scheduled to speak with European leaders. European input is important. The key European countries, UK, France, Germany, Poland, Italy, have a strong position on Ukraine, one informed by an understanding of the Russians. The American administration can benefit from the European advice on this one. Now, whether Trump takes that advice, I can't say, but I'm feeling somewhat more hopeful about the Trump administration's position going into the Alaska talks because they're starting to walk back their expectations. My theory is that the Trump people settled on this meeting with Putin thinking that Putin was ready to deal. I don't think Putin is ready to deal. I think that the special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, misinterpreted what Putin told him, or Putin was deliberately obscure. But in any event, the Americans, instead of doubling down, are becoming more cautious about their expectations. So I think the chances of a catastrophe in Alaska are lower than they were. And I think the possibility does exist of a decent outcome if, but only if, the Americans make it clear, Trump makes it clear to Putin, that we're prepared to put much more pressure on Russia and work with the Europeans to back Ukraine. Now, that's possible. And I'm not saying we'll get there, but it is possible to have a decent outcome to this meeting if the Americans approach Putin from a position of strength, which I think we've got. You mentioned Russian gains on the ground in eastern Ukraine. This is true. But we've heard stories like this for well over a year. Gains have not yet led to a breakthrough. And the cost to the Russians is high. Mm-hmm. We can put more pressure on the Russian economy. We can ramp up the flow of arms to Ukraine. And if we do,
but are we going to put more pressure?
Have to settle the war.
Do you think that the U.S. is actually going to commit to putting more pressure? Because you mentioned that these games have been going on, these games by Russia on the eastern Ukrainian front have been going on for quite some time already. But considering that there are sanctions, there are secondary sanctions, and there are these talks taking place, we would expect Vladimir Putin to actually halt and say, this is not the moment to be playing these games. Do you think that the U.S. is going to put even more pressure?
Well, you're asking the right question. The fact is, I don't know. Trump has tiptoed up to the line of actually putting more pressure on Russia, and then he always walks it back. Last Friday, the 8th, was supposed to be a deadline for more pressure. We let that slip. Trump has been criticizing Zelensky more. That's unfortunate. So I hope that Trump will realize that the way to win this one is to squeeze Putin hard, working with Europe. We have the ability to do so. There's more we can do to reduce Russian income from its sales of oil. Mm-hmm. If we do that, the Russian economy will hurt. We can do more to send more weapons to Ukraine. We can make it clear to Putin that his assessment of our weakness is mistaken. The Kremlin, as George Kennan wrote many years ago, is impervious to the logic of reason, but it is highly sensitive to the logic of force. And I think Poles would generally agree. Start the conversation with the Russians by showing that you have the strength to push them back and do it. Do it. That's the way to get the best possible deal for Ukraine and for us all.
This is exactly what I had a conversation about with Ivana Stratner last night when she said the West is actually starting to understand the language the Kremlin speaks. And this is going to get us closer to turning that corner. Donald Trump is a man of a certain self-confidence. What do you think would have to happen on Friday for him to for Vladimir Putin to actually push him over the line and possibly get him even closer, get Mr. Trump closer to Ukraine?
It's pretty clear that Putin is a master of obfuscation. He can be very charming. He can throw at you facts and figures which are all wrong, but he will try to dominate the conversation and run out the clock. I think that Trump should be very direct with Putin and should tell him that the time for games is over, the time to settle is now, and that we're not interested in a long explanation of the 17th century about Russia and Ukraine. We want the war ended. And if Putin doesn't do it the easy way, we will do it the hard way. We will squeeze the Russian economy and support Ukraine. I think he has to be blunt and direct with Putin.
But do you think that words are enough, or are we going to see some other movements take place after Friday?
Putin will be most unimpressed by words alone, so we have to be prepared to take those steps. We have the ability to put more pressure on Russia. This is not impossible. It isn't even that hard. We know what the options are. We need to exercise them. We need to start the conversation by putting pressure on Russia and then see if the Russians are in a more reasonable frame of mind.
Mm-hmm. We've heard from President Trump about the territorial concessions. He said that something's got to give and both sides will have to give up something. We also heard that during the Sunday interview of Vice President J.D. Vance. What kind of concessions are we talking about? What could possibly be in the cards?
Well, there is a very big difference between recognizing a front line as an existing reality and formally officially recognizing annexation. You probably recall the U.S. position about the Soviet illegal occupation of the Baltic states. We recognized it as reality, but we never recognized it formally. We refused to recognize Soviet incorporation of the Baltic states. And we ought to refuse to recognize officially any territorial concessions to Russia. Now, that existing line can be like the line between East Germany and West Germany during the Cold War, a line we recognize as reality, but not formally. There's a big difference. And diplomats, I used to be one, are paid to find the words to bridge these kinds of gaps. And if Putin won't like it, of course, he wants us formally to recognize new international borders for Ukraine, and we ought to just refuse. So there is some space for a deal. Now, that the front line can be adjusted one way or another. But the point is, we should not, unless the Ukrainians agree to it, we should not recognize new international borders created by force.
This is the talk about the territorial concessions, about the borders, but Putin has publicly demanded that Ukraine renounce NATO membership, something that we've covered extensively here on TVP World, a possibility of Ukraine one day joining the NATO. Is the upcoming meeting in Alaska going to curb Ukraine's hopes for the membership once and for all?
Well, President Trump should in no way give Putin an undeserved concession by saying Ukraine can never join NATO. Now, I think Ukraine ought to be in NATO. I think NATO defending Ukraine is a lot more practical than I would have thought 15 years ago, because Ukraine has managed pretty much on its own to defend itself. But look, if that is not possible for now, don't give Putin a promise, but simply find other ways to help Ukraine maintain its security after a settlement. Now, the British-French-led coalition of the willing has said, in principle, they're willing to send forces into Ukraine. Now, I don't think a couple of brigades are going to make that much difference, but I think, let's say, serious air defense units, training units, and other kinds of units in Ukraine would make Putin think twice before he started the war again.
Obviously.
So there are things we can do to support Ukraine's security, and we ought to do it.
I mean, all of these units do send a clear signal that there are eyes on Ukraine. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Daniel Fried, former U.S. ambassador to Poland, was my guest. And so this would be all for now. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and you were watching World News Tonight. I do hope to see you back here tomorrow at 8 p.m. CET for another program.